I'm very pleased to be here today and doing stories of Dr. Frank Kitamoto for the sake of the children. And I'll begin by acknowledging that the land from where I am standing and where this historical museum is on Suquamish territory. The Suquamish expert fishermen, canoe builders, and basket weavers live in harmony with the lands and waterways along Washington's central Sailor Sea as they have for thousands of years. Here, the Suquamish people live and protect the land and waters of their ancestors for future generations, as promised by the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. So honoring history and honoring the Suquamish people here. Today, we are welcoming stories, your stories, and we are going to hear from 4 honored guests who are going to speak about Dr. Frank Kitamoto. And so to my honored guests, thank you for being here. And I'd love for you to say your name and maybe a sentence about your connection, but just briefly, because we'll hear from you later. And I guess I will start with Lilly, then Lucas, then Chasity, then Karen. So Lilly, introduce yourself, please.
Oh, I'm Lilly Kodama, and I was Frank's big sister.
Thank you. And Lucas?
Yeah, hi you all. So my name is Lucas Massa, and I'm just going to be speaking about my experience with the Dr. Kitamoto Award and being nominated.
Thanks. Chasity?
I'm Chasity Malatesta. I'm a high school science teacher and also the co-chair of the Multicultural Advisory Council, which Frank Kitamoto founded over 37 years ago.
And thank you. And Karen?
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. My name is Karen Vargas. I guess I met Frank years ago when I arrived here on Bainbridge and was working with the Bainbridge Island School District with the Multicultural Advisory Council.
That's great. Thanks so much. Welcome all of you. I'm so honored to have you here. And Karen, would you please give us some background and introduce the clip that we're going to see?
Well, one of the things that I like to do, I would like to make sure that we are honoring Dr. Frank Kitamoto and all of his work here. One of the things that is very important, Frank was very immersed in working with our students at the school. And so I met Frank in the library when he was assembling the exhibit that he had there in the library that he honored every year. We honored our Japanese American community and introduced that to the students. And so I was privileged to be able to be a sidekick to assembling that exhibit, which takes quite a bit of effort. And so Frank and I got to know each other quite a bit as we worked with our students. But he also worked with the students and he would go to the classrooms and he would go to field trips to present the exhibit. And so for the sake of the children, we'd like to introduce this video clip.
Thank you. So Barbara, if you could introduce, that would be great. You play.
That time, I'm thinking, you know, my father wasn't with us most of the time, and I think that had a real effect on me. I think the general attitude at that time was destroy most things that are Japanese because we don't want the FBI to come and get us and take us away. So a lot of my cultural background was probably taken away or hidden. And the implication from that is that it's not a good deal to be Japanese. And I think a lot of that happened because of the concentration camp period. And I think, although we as children say we weren't as affected because as a grown-ups they went through the hardship and all the things that they lost and so forth, you can't help feeling like that feeling of despair and the feeling of not being treated as equals other people, and the feeling of fright and so forth did not transfer to us. I'm sure it transferred to us, and I think it had a lot to do with me growing up, spending a lot of time wishing that I was white, that I could be as good an American as the rest of the kids that I knew in my class, and trying as hard as I can probably to deny a lot of my Japanese heritage, without being smart enough to realize that somebody just had to look at me and know I wasn't white, you know, because you tried so hard to fit in, so hard to be a person of significance, and still felt like you had the handicap of not being the same as everybody else there.
So that clip helps to give a perspective, I think, of what Karen was talking about, that Frank was very aware of how students could feel as if they aren't included. And one way that one thing I love about Frank is that when I first came to the island, and I came from a very different place. I came from Oakland, California, and I felt like really a fish out of water, even though I actually looked like everybody and acted like everybody. And so this sense of welcoming was amazing. And I know Karen's talked to me before about how it was really bumping into Frank when he was doing that exhibit at the high school that was one of the first times that Karen felt welcome on the island. So this idea that you're a whole person, and this idea that all of you is accepted, was something that really made an impression on me about Frank. And so I know that one place that I worked a lot with Frank was the Multicultural Advisory Council. And at one point we created the Frank Kitamoto Award. So Karen, could you just give us that feeling of how we started that award? And then we'll hear from some other people.
The award really was birthed right after Frank had passed away, and we were all still grieving. Our community was grieving, our families were grieving, our young people was grieving, and we were ready to wrap up the school year with the Multicultural Advisory Council, and the students wanted to ensure that Frank's legacy was not lost. And so they wanted to create the Dr. Frank Kitamoto Social Justice and Racial Justice Award. And it was important for them because Frank was the one that would load up his van and take them to the Kitsap County Human Rights and he would load them up and take them to the Kitsap County youth rallies, and he would be at the with the Martin Luther King assemblies, and he had made that type of impact with our students, and they did not want that history or that legacy lost. So that was kind of how the Frank Kitamoto Award was birthed out of the love and grieving of the loss that we were experiencing at the time. And I think it was something that the students wanted it to be known throughout the school, the work that Frank had done for so many years. And so we wanted to preserve that history.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm going to invite one of our fellow MAC members. Chastity is with Karen leading us in MAC this actually for the past few years. And so Chastity, could you tell us something about the criteria and maybe introduce the award winner?
I do. One of Frank's quote was, "Children need to feel okay about who they are and realize they don't have to be white to be successful." His commitment to the community as a really good dentist and also a leader, and as Karen said, that birthed this award. And so the interesting thing is that it's peer to peer, and so a peer gets to nominate them. And I think it matters a great deal that we have a young man, Lucas Massa, who's on here, who was nominated by a friend named Sophie. And the qualities around Frank Kitamoto is a dedication to community, a dedication to service, a dedication to being inclusive and looking out for others. And peer-to-peer awards to me matter immensely. And she said, Lucas is one of the leaders of BHS's saga, Sexuality and Gender Alliance. He's a great influence and I look up to him. He's done so much for our school. He leads and organized activities. He promotes positivity and equality. He is so positive all the time. He radiates love, makes wonderful jokes, is committed to social justice, and he's impacted our school and our lives in our community. He takes up for marginalized groups and even idea of creating a transgender day at BHS. Sophie wanted to honor you as Frank Kitamoto's legacy. Congratulations, Lucas.
Yeah, thank you so much, you guys. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Chastity, for the introduction. So hello, you all. I wanted to thank you all for coming today. My name, again, is Lucas Massa. I'm a sophomore currently attending Bainbridge High School, and I received the Dr. Kitamoto Award after being nominated by one of my club members, who was Sophie. I'm the vice president of the Sexuality and Gender Alliance, and it was because of my work through this club establishing equality and encouraging diversity in the community I was awarded the Dr. Kitamoto Award. Specifically, I put together a project for Transgender Day of Remembrance, which was mentioned, remembering the lives of transgender people who had been lost this past year. It was important for Bainbridge High School to recognize the discrimination that continues today against transgender people, and I was able to establish this recognition through my work advocating. I'm more than honored to have received this award, and I'm grateful to be with you all today to celebrate Dr. Kitamoto, who he was, and his work in the community. Although I didn't have the opportunity to meet Dr. Kitamoto myself, I know that he was a man that worked to spread equality and acceptance in the community. He spread awareness for those who were struggling, and he was an ally to those who were mistreated. His activism that worked to end hatred and bigotry impacted the Bainbridge Island community greatly. And again, I'm more than honored to have received this award that reflects upon Dr. Kitamoto and his values. So thank you all so much for listening. And I'm really grateful to be here all with you, honoring Dr. Kitamoto. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucas. That's great. I was wondering, and so Chastity, like Lucas, you didn't have the privilege to meet Dr. Kitamoto, but I was wondering, how did you get to know, and what's your reflection of Frank?
I had the privilege of hearing Karen. I mean, when we have these holders of history, these vessels like Clarence Morwalkie and Karen on the island, and several of our elders who hold these stories, Karen presses upon in MAC the importance of holding history. And Katie took time to make sure that we every MAC member walked through and understood the Japanese internment, the story, and it's the best story of allyship on Bainbridge Island. There are going to be more stories, but this is one of the most amazing stories. Every kid at Bainbridge High School needs to understand that this island has a commitment to allyship, and we need to uphold the standard for all marginalized groups based on the fact of Frank Kitamoto's work. Karen Vargas talks about the history of Frank Kitamoto in that he laid a foundation for a dentist who had a commitment to 25 years of being the president of BIJAC, a holder, a space that held culture, love, and community. And there's a model in there, and there's a reason why Clarence needs to keep telling the story, and that BHS needs to be first before he travels around the world, because this story impacts every student on this island. And if they can impart and leave empowered by Frank's story, by Clarence continuing to tell the story, by Karen Vargas continuing to tell the story of the marginalized children and the other groups that are growing, do you know what? We're going to launch an amazing group of individuals on this island that care and are dedicated to allyship. And so I learned more from Clarence because of Mochi and him continuing to tell the story. So Frank is alive. He's alive. Like, we need t-shirts that say, "Be like Frank." Like, he's the real deal. And we'll have "Be like Karen," "Be like Frank." We will hold the history. We won't let anyone forget. And I think that Katie gave me the little memorial tags, the internment tags, and I keep them in my MAC binder under the first page. So every time we meet, I remember I'm here because of the shoulders and the parents and the families that continue to dedicate themselves to allyship. And I'm just grateful that we still have holders of history on our island now.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Chasity. And so now, to bring a little personal note in, I invite Frank's big sister, Lilly Kodama. Could you give us a little bit of insight of the Frank that you knew growing up, and then the man he turned into?
Well, I was 5 years older than Frank, but he passed me up a long time ago. But when he was little, he was known as the crybaby. He always hung around Mama and didn't like to leave her side, and I was always the one who had to look after him. But he grew up. I think he was, even as a small child, was a sensitive child, and so I remember when I was in college. I think I was either a freshman or a sophomore. My mother asked me to meet Frank, and she wanted me to take him to the Bon Marché, which is now Macy's, and help him pick out a shirt. And so I was in charge of him. And when we went to the store, the department store, the clerk didn't even speak to me. He talked to Frank, and I was so irked by that. I think that was a time when they just looked to, even if he was a young man. I think he was only 13 or 12. I can't remember. But anyway, that bothered me, that here was this, I was in charge, but this clerk was paying attention to Frank, but he's always been someone who cared about the underdog, and he was so instrumental in telling the story of what happened to the Japanese during World War II. And I should tell you, he also, when I was married and had my first child, and Frank was, I think, just beginning college, and he babysat for my oldest son many times. And in fact, my son remembers that Uncle Frank is the one who took him out to different places, even more than I did, or my husband and I did. But anyway, he was always involved with young people, because he did lead a youth group through church, I remember, years ago. And so it was pretty telling. But when he passed away, I felt so sad. But it's just really been wonderful the way people have remembered him, and how the MAC has kept him alive, and it's just been wonderful to me.
Thank you, Lily. And yes, I know he's proud of you, the way that you had to step into all of the work that he was doing that was public work, and into leading helping to lead the Japanese community.
Well, it's something I really didn't and still don't feel very comfortable doing, but I feel like someone has to carry on what's so important to him. And one that's important to me too, but I just still marvel that he was able to do all that he has accomplished, but he couldn't have done it without everyone's support. So it's
Yeah, I remember about that too. One of the things about one of the reasons to do this in the beginning of March is because March 30th is the anniversary of when our neighbors were excluded, and when Lily and Frank and her family and other Japanese American families on the island in 1942 were excluded from their homes on Bainbridge, and the Bainbridge community had, their neighbors ripped away. And I just think that it's an important story to keep telling, and it's been hard to fill those shoes. And I love the story about how Frank and Junko and Don, I think those were Junko Harui and Don Nakata, kind of got together. I think it was in maybe the late 80s. You and Clarence can correct me. And they felt like, although everybody that experienced, just like a lot of wars, everybody who experienced World War II was not speaking about it. They really felt like they wanted to hear the stories. And so they went on a mission and started collecting oral histories from the elders and speaking about what happened. And so from his initiation of doing that, and then he also actually made a film that people can find on the internet that is called After Silence. And that film was filmed with high school students, Bainbridge High School students, talking about the experience of exclusion. And so it really opened up the island to knowing more about the story. And I think that it opened up an awareness of wanting to create the exclusion memorial, which is still growing today, and then having a ceremony every March 30th to remember. And so that's one of the reasons why we picked March, to honor Frank's memory. So let's see, I just wanted to ask if Karen, maybe if you wanted to add to some of your memories of Frank, and then invite people to write in the chat, any of the questions, or if you'd like to speak, maybe raise your hand, because we're here to honor Dr. Kitamoto and hear stories so that the people who are here in this group can pass along what they've learned and what they've heard, so that all Bainbridge Islanders, if you say Dr. Frank Kitamoto, would recognize his name as well as we recognize, like, Dr. Martin Luther King. So Karen, do you have any other story that you'd like to share? I think you're on mute still, Karen. No.
Karen, oh, there you are. You're not muted.
Good morning, good afternoon now, everyone. One of my favorite stories was when Frank and I was transporting some of the young people to Bremerton for the Human Rights Conference, and we thought we had all of the rides kind of lined up. And we had to call in the troops. We had to call in some of the troops to begin to carpool them down. And Frank was calling in Jerry Elfendahl and myself and all of us. And then when we got them down there, they had all of their classes and different things that they attended. And on the way back, Frank was like, woo, we got that done. And what he was really saying was it was worth it. It was worth all of the challenge. It was worth, all of the bumps in the road. But what he saw was the kids had the opportunity to understand what human rights was, what the civil rights was, to be able to speak into their spirit, to be able to transform their mindsets and create this opportunity for them to be able to attend, was something that he was very passionate about for so many years. And even when Frank wasn't feeling well, and we knew he wasn't feeling well, he was extending and pushing himself to make sure that those young people were going to attend the Kitsap County Human Rights Conference every year. And that thing has always stuck in my heart. His drive, his heart, for it. It wasn't just lip service, but he walked it, he talked it, he modeled it, he shared it, and he began to impart all that wisdom to our children. And our children was changed by it. Their whole hearts and minds were changed by the things that Frank was sharing with them. And that is the best memory that I could ever have of Frank and his impact that he had on the lives of our young people.
Thank you, Karen. So I just happened to notice that we do have Clarence and Milwaukee, and we also have Lorraine Scott, who Lorraine worked for the Historical Museum when it was moving from the center of the island to the spot where it is now. And I wondered if either Clarence or if Lorraine, you had any Frank stories to tell. I'm putting you on the spot.
I'll go. You say all the wonderful things about Frank. What I remember about Frank mostly is who he was as a person. And I always say that he had a 1,000-watt smile. And if you were ever in a crowded room, you didn't have to look for him. You had to keep your ears open. And you'd hear this warm outpouring of laughter. It would almost always be Frank. He's always cracking the corniest jokes you've ever heard. But he was always joyful. And so you could always hear his laughter even when things were tough. A couple stories that I have, when I first got to really know him was, I moved to the island in 99, and just got involved with the Japanese American community because I think it was Isa Matsudaira saw my name in the phone book. Phone books are things, kids, that we used to use. And joined BIJAC at that time, and he was an icon even then. Then September 11th happened, and back in 2000, we had this idea for this memorial. And we heard about this place in New Denver, British Columbia. And by the way, the Canadian Japanese had it way worse than Japanese Americans, if you can imagine that. But that's a whole nother story. But we were told by some folks from the Interfaith Council to go investigate this place. And so our community had thought we'd have a caravan of minivans, and we'd go up there. And so Frank and I both used our credit cards and charged up every room in the one bed and breakfast in town. and we were all going to go on September 18th, 2001. But 1 week earlier, September 11th had just occurred. And so everybody said, I'm fearful of traveling. I really don't want to go. We didn't know how it would happen. But Frank and I were determined to go. So it was just Frank and me. Fortunately, the people in that community, there was a big wedding reception and they needed hotel rooms. So our credit cards got cleared up pretty fast because we didn't. One thing Sharon did warn me, Sharon, his wife, that Frank snores. So if you do have rooms, make sure you're far apart. I have rooms far apart because you don't want to have your sleep disturbed. And we drove all the way to Spokane, which is about 5 hours, another 5 hours north. And so it was just Frank and me for 10, 11 hours in the car in his Ford Windstar minivan. And so I really got to know him. And that's when we became friends, was because we got to know each other. We told our stories. We had a lot of laughs. And then the experience in New Denver was just really overwhelming. And of course we had to drive back. So I was very fortunate. I had, 4 days with him, just us together, experiencing the drive together, going to the dinners together. And what I discovered was, you're saying all these wonderful things about what he was and his passions, but all of us know him as a person. He was just a genuinely warm, funny, humble guy. And there's a lot of elevation here about his accomplishments, and I think those are warranted. But more importantly, he's just a good human being, and it's the biggest honor in my life that I got to be considered one of his good friends. He was always upbeat, even when things were bad. But there was one time where I saw him really defeated. As many of you know, we started this project 20 years ago. And there was a person on the island, James Olson, who was a white supremacist, Japanese incarceration denier. And the Sakai Middle School had started their Leaving Our Island curriculum, and he opposed it. His daughter was going to be in the school in that class the next year, and it became a big story for those who weren't here. I mean, it was national. I mean, I was interviewed on CNN and the New York Times. It was a big deal. Him and his wife and another guy, John Alpal, made this huge thing that we were doing all this political correctness and the Japanese deserve to be in the camps and blah, blah, blah. And so we were going to take that exhibit that Karen talked about to the Cherry Blossom Festival in Seattle. And so we're going onto the ferry, and right at the top of the hour, it's CBS News, and there's James Olson on the radio. I mean, he's talking about our curriculum here on our island. And so we drove onto the ferry, and it's AM radio, so you get onto the ferry and you lose the signal. And we drove on, parked, and Frank turned off the car, and he just shook his head. He kind of put his head on the steering wheel, because the last words we heard before we got on the ferry was that he said, and this Frank Kitamoto's father was a spy, and we know it. And then the sound cut off. And so people heard that international, or certainly nationwide radio, that this asshole was accusing his father of being a spy, and it was out there. And it was the first time I'd seen him dejected, and it was really hard. And I've told the story, and I didn't know what to say, and sometimes these things just come out of orifices of your body. And I said, Frank, I'm really grateful for James Olson. And he turned to me, and Frank had a WTF face, like, what? I said, Frank, here's why I'm grateful, because, he's just a minority right now. But, back in the day when my father was back there, and he was America. James Olson was America. And he's a reminder of how awful it was for our ancestors. And so then he kind of agreed, and we had a lot better discussion. I think it brought him out of that dejection, but that was a very incredibly hurtful thing that he he heard that his father was, on national radio being accused of being a treasonous person against America. So he got hit by things sometimes, but the most dominant thing you got to remember about Frankie was always being on the positive and finding, the good in people. And at his last speech, public speech, he was the keynote speaker at the Minidoka Pilgrimage in 2008, where we go every year to, groups go to visit the former concentration camp. And Frank's last line in his speech, and it's the last line in my Humanities Washington presentation, is, the opposite of love is not hate, it is fear. And he has it right on. It's fear that's driving everything that goes against people of color or people of sexual minorities or immigrants or whatever. And it's a 1-2 punch. You're scared about losing your job, blame the immigrants. It's just this 1-2, you got to blame somebody because you're fearful of something. And Frank nailed it right away. And if you leave with anything, remember that quote of his. The opposite of love is not hate, it's fear. And I'd like to say on March 30th, we are going to have a ceremony there at the site. It's our commemoration of when Lilly and the others were taken away from the island, being the first ones. It's going to be live streamed, and it's going to be a limited invitation only, most for survivors like Lilly and other survivors to be there. And one of the things we're going to do is, of course, read all the names, but then our exclusion departure deck is completed. So it's going to be our ceremonial ribbon cutting for those survivors to cut this deck that represents how they left the island on March 30th. And 6 o'clock that evening, the BIJAMA, Bainbridge Island Japanese American Exclusion Memorial Association, will sponsor my Humanities Washington presentation. So it'll be a free sign up live stream event on March 30th at 6 p.m. So hope you can tune in if you haven't seen it.
Thank you so much, Clarence. That's just wonderful. I was wondering if anybody else had any memories that they would like to share. There are so many connections that can be made, and I also just want to really thank Frank's wife, Sharon. I see that you're here, and it's an honor to have you present too. I think that you and Lilly are the survivors that I know that are here on the call with us today. And I just wanted to tell a little story, which was Marilee Mostov, who is our director of exhibits and engagement at the Historical Museum. She's been doing some great programs that you can find online that are called Curious Curators. And she did one on skate park. And one of the interviews on there, and you can see this, one of the skaters that got almost kind of famous and everything on Bainbridge Island, he talked about how Frank was somebody that advocated for the skateboarders on Bainbridge Island. So I just thought that was a wonderful story. I don't know if Sharon knows more about it, but it's just great. He pops up in a lot of the other stories. We had a panel in the beginning of the year, and it was 3 Bainbridge Island African-American men talking about being Bainbridge Islanders. And James Friday, one of them, said that Frank was one of the, he felt welcomed by Frank. And again, Frank was the one that was like, yes, you belong, and yes, you're welcome. And so I just love the way that either he was your dentist, or he welcomed you to the island, or he stood up for your skate park, or whatever that was. I just think that that's really great. And so I could tell a lot of stories, but I'd love to hear from anybody? I don't know if I can tag
Katie,
Scott. Yes, Karen?
I just wanted to say to Miss Sharon Kitamoto, Sharon, I wanted to thank you for allowing me to come into your place of business at any given time and to rush in and say, "Is Frank here? I need to talk to Frank." And sometimes Frank would be, in his dentist chair, and you were so gracious, Sharon, and always welcomed me and always allowed me to drink your tea. And I just wanted to thank you for welcoming me and for you and Frank to always have your door open and welcoming. I I look at the building now every time I pass by the high school, and there's so many stories there with our meetings. Jack used to meet in there. I used to run over from the United Brothers and Sisters at the school district and run straight over to Frank's office and run things by him. But he always was so gracious and welcoming to me. And you, Sharon, you were a trooper. because I did that quite often, and I wanted to thank you personally for that.
And I want to add that it's because of Sharon that Frank was able to participate in so many of these events, because she was the one who reshuffled his appointments and changed his schedule so that he could take time away from his practice and still maintain his patient care in spite of all the extracurricular work he was doing. So it's because of Sharon that he was able to do so much of what he did.
And like to add, to Sharon and Frank that his office was the repository of everything by Jack, and the extra offices that were off to the side that were not occupied by other dentists are now were occupied by, oh my gosh, so much material that he kept storing video cassettes and books, and he was a massive resource collector. Now, someone say, yeah, he's a junk collector. No, he saw value in all of these things that were being brought. And so we have an incredible trove of history that he preserved for us that had that office not been there, I don't know where they would have gone. So there was a physical gift of that office that was important for BIJAC and for this community overall.
Yeah, I was involved in the Historical Museum from, I started volunteering there in 2002, and I was the curator from 2005 to 2009. And I was there when we redid the exhibits in the schools, and of course we took sort of a timeline approach to the history of the island, and I was there during the Jim Olsen experience, and it was quite a thing for a young professional to have to deal with this kind of real hatred about your history. I'd also, Frank was certainly part of that generation of people. I grew up on the island, so Kay Nakau was my grandma's neighbor, and I knew her my whole life. And Frank was certainly that generation of folks that helped local kids, and I'm echoing kind of what Karen's saying too, but I remember being at Blakely Elementary School in the mid-1980s when the Cast a Long Shadow was first produced, and then of course the Let It Not Happen Again, the portable exhibit that was put in the frames that would go around to the different schools, and I know he was certainly so much part of that. It was such being able to influence young people is so important, and I will never forget to this day the day I was sitting in 4th grade and in walked Hisa Matsudaira, and I thought, why is my PE teacher walking in to the classroom, and why are we sitting here listening? It's not PE. Why is Mrs. Matsudaira here? And
And then she started to give her story about the camps and what had happened. And of course, to me, as a fourth grader, I had, I wasn't really aware. And it was absolutely, I will never forget that experience of having somebody who has lived a historical event come and talked about it as a person that I just related to as a nice teacher and my PE teacher. And what a gift that was. So Frank certainly was part of that incredible movement to get that ball rolling on the island, to start talking about it. And I that's just a one thing. So hello to all those folks that I don't see much anymore, but thank you, Katie, for inviting me. I wouldn't have heard about this otherwise, so this is great.
Oh, what a wonderful story, Lorraine. Thank you so much. It's really, really wonderful. I'm loving playing with this idea too, that it's Women's Day. Lily, I just wanted to ask a little bit about your mom and how Frank, because he was the boy in the family, he was going to church. I'm going to college, but I thought maybe you'd talk about your mom on Women's Day today.
Well, when I graduated from Bainbridge High School, I wanted to go on to college. When I approached my father, he said, nope, I've got to save money for Frank. And you don't need to go to college. I'm going to send, I'm saving our money to send Frank. And that, when my mother heard that, that upset her because she had to quit school in the 6th grade to help on the farm. And so she said to my father, well, then I'll make money to send Lily to school. And it's amazing because in those days, I think the tuition for 1 quarter was $55. But I think when you think about that, it's astounding. But anyway, that prompted her, and my father said, what can you do? You don't know anything but farming. Well, that's when she started. She did some research and found that maybe she should raise raspberries. And so she started the first raspberry farming on Bainbridge Island. And so then, and it turned out that her raspberry farm actually paid more for Frank's dental school tuition than my father's business. And it turns out that both Frank and I are the 2 siblings in the family who helped every summer my mother on the farm. My other siblings had other summer jobs. One worked in the clinic on Bainbridge, and my other sister worked at the bank. But Frank and I worked on the farm. And so, so my mother was a first woman who did a lot of things in spite of her 6th grade education. And actually, all 4 of us did graduate from the University of Washington.
Oh, somebody asked for your mother's name, Lily, in the chat.
Oh, her name was Shigeko Kitamoto.
When they were opening up the memorial, they were having the grand opening and the tour, and Frank asked our young people from our Living Life leadership team to be docents. And I can tell you on that day, they said they were Japanese. They wanted to assimilate. They wanted to be a part of that. And I'll never forget that Frank welcomed them in as if they had been at the table all along. And that for them was very, very honoring that they were considered part of the story and part of the family. And I just wanted to thank Lily, and I wanted to thank Clarence, and I wanted to thank our community for sharing Frank with us, just allowing him to be who he was. And the last thing I say to Frank, he was a touchable. And when I say he was a touchable, anybody, he welcomed anybody. And like you said, Clarence, he was an icon, but he was very touchable. he was very welcome, and you could approach him and you can talk to him. And he always walked in humility. And we'll forever remember the Frank Kitamoto that welcomed us all in.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you, Karen. And thank you, Lily. And thanks to Lucas. He had to get off the meeting because he had to go back to school. And thank you, Chasity, for being our honored guests to speak about Dr. Kitamoto. Thank you for all the people that did have a chance to share. And I just want to let you know that that kind of welcoming spirit is what we really honor that at the Historical Museum, and wanting to hear stories, different stories that haven't been told, and being that welcoming to everybody to listen, to be able to listen to all the stories is very important. And I want to thank Barb from the Senior Center. We have a wonderful partnership here with the Senior Center, doing this every second Tuesday of the month. And I wish you all lots of hearts full of, you know, Mother Earth love today on International Women's Day. And think of Frank, and see you on maybe March 30th.